Hi, and welcome to the Right Voices interview series with the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, or C3 Solutions. I'm co-founder John Hart, and I'm also the executive editor of our news magazine called C3. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Congressman Frank Lucas. Congressman Lucas represents the 3rd District of Oklahoma. He was first elected back in 1994 and serves as the ranking member of the House Science Committee and is also the former chair of the House Ag Committee. Thanks so much for joining us today, Congressman.
Absolutely, John. It's a pleasure to be with you and visit about the things that are really important in the world these days.
Well, this is a very, contentious, complicated, controversial issue. So why don't we just kind of dive right into it? So you recently joined the Conservative Climate Caucus that your colleague, Rep. John Curtis, put together. Why don't you tell us kind of your journey from being from Oklahoma, being in a state that's an oil and gas state, and also to give some kind of our viewers some context. So I used to work for Senator Tom Coburn. So I first met you, 25 years ago on a campaign bus. So I was a staffer in another office. I wouldn't say we knew each other, but you're a familiar person to me. And I know a lot about Oklahoma, but not nearly as much as you do. So kind of describe your journey of where you're from and how you got to where you are.
Absolutely, John. And perhaps a little context about the nature of my district. I represent, as you alluded to, essentially the northwest half of the great state of Oklahoma. I represent that part of Oklahoma that Mr. Steinbeck made infamous in the Grapes of Wrath, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the drought of the 1930s. My grandparents were young men and women in that period. My parents were little kids. My parents started school, both of them, in 1st grade in 1937. A tough time to be in rural Oklahoma. I'm a farmer by background, by trade, by experience. My university training is agricultural economics. I come at this subject matter not just as a member of Congress, but also as a farmer. My wife refers to herself as the rancher. She calls me the farmer. That's just fine. But as a farmer in Roger Mills County, Oklahoma, and weather patterns are changing. As a farmer, a rancher, I watch very closely the rainfall. I watch the weather patterns, how much grass we produce, what kind of crops we can raise, when we can plant, when we can harvest. And weather patterns are changing. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that weather patterns are changing because of global industrial activity. That's something we need to focus on, John, because some of the liberals I serve with here in the United States House would tell you that the entire problem is the United States, or maybe it's the oil and gas industry in Oklahoma. No, weather patterns are affected by global activity, worldwide global activity. Think of industrial behemoths like mainland China. So I see the weather patterns changing. I address these through agricultural policies, the Farm Bill, and also in my role on the Science Committee, because we're the committee with jurisdiction over the basic research programs. Think about the National Science Foundation. Think about the energy research programs, the civilian programs at the Department of Energy, our jurisdiction over NOAA, the National Weather Service, all of those kind of things. And the space program, the satellites at NASA. By the way, Science Committee is a fun committee. I mean, there's lots of amazing things going on. But I've seen the weather patterns change. I think we have to acknowledge that. And we have to begin to address how we responsibly respond, John. And that's why I became a part of the Conservative Climate Caucus, because you can't just put your head in the sand. You've got to respond. And in fairness, John, again, I put my finger back on some of my more liberal colleagues up here. There are folks that I serve with in Congress who believe that the federal government knows everything, and most assuredly knows how to do everything, and that no individual has the capacity to make their own decisions or any sense of responsibility. And that's totally bogus. So that's where it brings me on the Science Committee. My view is, instead of using taxes and regulatory actions to exterminate certain segments of the economy that provide energy, just because we don't like what part of the ground it came out of, or we don't like which part of the country it comes from, our responsibility on the federal level is to invest in the research programs that will create the next generation of energy, or improve the efficiency and lower the carbon footprint of existing sources of energy, and then let the markets decide where to go. I'm not here to tell you to go to fusion power. I'm not here to make you turn off crude oil consumption. but I'm here to make the investments so that if we really can turn water into electricity using the mechanics of the sun, or if we can really make natural gas even more efficient with a smaller carbon footprint through research, so that industry will take that up, that's where we'll go. I'm not the stick guy. Most of those folks are down at the White House right now or in the speaker's office. I'm the carrot guy. Give you the ability to do the right thing for the right reason because it's in your best interest. Market economics.
Right. Well, that's a great analogy. So talk to me a little bit more about some of these solutions. You know, what are some of the care and to maybe flesh out for our listeners, when you talk about sticks, I think we're talking about things like the Green New Deal, where the left wants to shut down major sectors of the economy. It's one of the arguments we make with C3 Solutions is we need to have an all of the above energy strategy.
Exactly.
Too often the left has everything but nuclear, everything but natural gas or fossil fuels. So it describes some of the specific carrots that you think are goals that Republicans and conservatives are pushing for right now in the House of Representatives.
First off, John, you're entirely right. If you go through and take dramatic sources of energy off the table, if you say we can't use natural gas after a certain date, if you say the way to stop using crude oil is to forbid the manufacture of combustion engines after a certain date, if you say we can't develop the next generation of fusion power, the traditional atomic power plants that are smaller, safer, more efficient, if you take that off the page, if you don't want to spend the necessary money on fusion, the power of the sun, the next generation there, then you're limiting us to wind, solar. You're saying that we're going to have to build the most amazing battery complexes around the country in order to store that power when it's dark or when the wind doesn't blow. And how many solar panels are we going to have to put up all over North America? How many windmills are we going to have to put up over North America? Now, I'm not opposed to any of those sources of energy as long as they make economic sense. But my liberal friends are so focused on their dogma, their philosophical point of view, that they would strangle existing sources. Now, who's going to pay for the price for this? Well, it'll be the American consumer and American industry, because we are very energy intensive kind of people in the United States. That's why we enjoy the standard of living we have. That's why we have the manufacturing efficiencies that we have. Not everybody does that. If you don't think that's the case, look at how many coal-fired plants the Chinese add every month still to this day. Look at the way the crude oil industry works in certain parts of the world. The bottom line, of course, once again, you come back around to this, is don't turn off any existing sources of energy, but invest in basic research to make what we have more efficient and to get us to that next generation of energy, and then let the market, the economy go that way. That will hold down cost, which means people will still be able to be cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and they'll be able to eat in an affordable and live a decent lifestyle. And we'll be able to compete with the rest of the world. I'm not sure everybody in the hard left actually wants to have any industry in the United States, which horrifies me, because that's how you create wealth. And by the way, when we develop these technologies, we're not going to hog them up, so to speak. We'll license them to the rest of the world to pay a fair fee to be able to develop these same technologies. It's called transferring wealth back to the United States. I like that concept, John. And that's just where we have to go. But I serve with a lot of folks here in Congress right now, and the majority, and I'd say a good number of political appointees down the executive branch, who clearly don't understand market economics, clearly are not very good on how industry and manufacturing works. And you really kind of wonder if they've ever heard of self-responsibility.
Well, speaking of market economics, so one of the papers that we recently published, it was authored by Nick Loris. Nick, a very, very gifted policy expert in this field. He was with the Heritage Foundation, and now is our VP of Public Policy at C3 Solutions. And Nick's paper is called "Free Economies or Clean Economies," and the conclusion that he makes is the environmental performance of freer economies is twice that as less free. And that's a story, I think, as conservatives that I appreciate that you're telling, and but not everybody understands that. So there's a degrowth movement even on the left where they're blaming, and this is what Fidel Castro actually argued too, is that if you let sort of the imperialists, the capitalists run free, you're going to have a dirty planet. But the opposite is actually true. So maybe talk about your experience just in economic freedom in Oklahoma. So you talked about being a farmer. I'm actually a farmer now. I'm in Maryland. I'm looking out my field. I've got soybeans. I just harvested wheat. I don't know what you're farming in Oklahoma, but there's a culture of property rights. Maybe you could talk about some of the examples and just stories, lessons learned from people that you grew up with and that you live with and work with every day.
I was raised in an area where the Great Depression was so severe. And you match that up with the drought of the 1930s, which was before the modern industrial economy, by the way, for the record. My home county had 14,000 people in it in the 1930 census. And because of federal policy decisions, the Homestead Act, which worked really great in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, where you could live on 160 acres and raise a family, didn't work in Western Oklahoma. It should have been 1,600 acres to have the same productivity. Mistakes by the federal government started down a terrible path. Then you look at the economic decisions of the 1930s. The Federal Reserve went the wrong direction. Fiscal policy was out of balance. It created a complete disaster, which was only ended by the advent of the Second World War. We went from 14,000 people to, when the final census numbers are released for my home county, we may be back to 3,500. 14,000. 3,500, a dramatic set of mistakes. And I would also acknowledge, as I point out often to my liberal friends here using friends in a very flowing sort of way, my liberal friends here, that if the command economy, where a central committee could make every decision, prioritize everything, worked, that utopia called the Soviet Union would still be there. And by the way, thank you, Ronald Reagan, for pushing them into the dustbin of history. But they went away. The riots in the streets of Cuba right now, because people are hungry and don't have basic resources, another command economy. Command economies don't work. You cannot have a central committee or set of committees deciding how to allocate resources. The Russians never had enough toilet paper or light bulbs for the entire 70-some years of the Soviet Union because they couldn't allocate it. We have to do things within the market approach. Again, I don't want to tell industry and people how to live their lives. I want to make the investments that take the technology to the next step, that industry will then adopt it and people will embrace it and move forward. That's why free economies, yes, are cleaner and more civilized, more thoughtful than command economies. Oh my goodness, my goodness. And it should be so obvious, but I serve with certain, shall we say, underclassmen in the United States House of Representatives who don't sit on my side of the room, who apparently long for the day of Fidel and Mikhail Gorbachev and might find the communist China to be the model. And by the way, even the Chinese, even though they maintain strict communist political control of the country, they've embraced the market economy. They have loosened up dramatically from the old Maoist system. It's still a tragedy for people who live there, but even they understood communist socialist economics was a dead end.
Right, right. Yeah, and what do you make of? You may have seen there was a group of progressive organizations that wrote a letter to the Biden administration urging them to essentially de-link human rights and climate in the context of China. And well, let me just ask what your view of that is, if you care to comment.
It is almost beyond imagination, because many of the progressives I serve with, now that's what they call themselves now. When I first was involved in politics, we would call them liberals. My father would have referred to them as socialist. I'm not sure what my grandfather would have called them, naive maybe, at the very best. That in order to maintain their perspective of what a utopian political system is, that they would ignore everything. We should never forget the Uyghurs in Western China. We should never forget the misery brought on in Cuba on the average citizens. But they're true believers. That group, they're true believers, but that's why we have to work hard to educate our fellow citizens to make sure that they don't wind up with control. I don't believe President Biden necessarily comes from that wing of the party, his party, but when you bring in so many of the old Obama administration people to be in your administration, when you bring on a super progressive to be your vice president, and you seem to embrace this crowd by intent, or heaven forbid, default, they're moving us, this administration is moving us in that direction.
Right. Well, and what is your view on another topic, infrastructure? So infrastructure is a front burner issue right now in Congress. There's a debate about how much should we expand the concept of infrastructure to include the things that aren't traditional roads and bridges, water infrastructure, and so forth. What is your view on that? Where do you think we end up? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, first off, there's a pattern here. If you remember in the last big COVID bill that came through after Joe Biden was sworn in as president, in the name of COVID relief, they passed trillions of dollars in spending. I won't say all of it, but most of it was not directed to COVID relief. It was a social, political, economic agenda. So that laid down the pattern. I think there would be overwhelming support for a huge infrastructure package in this country if it were roads, bridges, airports, highways. Because my colleagues on this side of the room understand that a more efficient transportation system means a more competitive economic model, the ability to outwork and outcompete the rest of the planet. But if in truth, the Dems are saying to my counties and states, you have too many highways, we're going to make sure you don't lay any more asphalt. I assume that means then they're not enthusiastic about wider, safer bridges. I would assume that means that seaports and railroads and airports just put more carbon in the air. Then this product is not going to help. It's not going to add to the economy. Now, can they slam it through using something called budget reconciliation? The irony of budget reconciliation is it's part of a 1974 law that was designed to make it easier to cut spending once a budget cycle. Cut. Did I make it come across with that? Cut spending. And in effect, they're going to wind up using budget reconciliation because no Republicans are going to support this ultimately, to increase spending by $3.5 trillion. You know, sometimes these things grow in the back room, $4, $5 trillion. If there was any semblance of normal in the world anymore, I'd say this isn't going to happen. But I don't know what to expect. I just know the path they're going down now will not make a dramatic, positive difference in the efficiencies of the transportation system in this country. And then that's just called, the polite phrase is spending it for naught.
Yes, exactly.
We won't use the Oklahoma phrase.
All right. Yeah, and I did a piece on this called Biden's Bridge Too Far recently on the C3 News magazine. And my concern is what, and you know, having been a staffer for many years in the House and Senate, is that when one side demands everything, they often end up with nothing. And it's kind of like taking yourself hostage and begging the other side not to shoot. That doesn't end well for the hostage taker.
Well put.
I don't, you know, people ask, but I don't really know if we'll get, if Democrats will get anything, because they've pushed so hard to go so far that even the scaled back version that I think a majority, a super majority of Republicans would support, what I'm hearing you say, correct me if I'm not understanding your point, is that even that scaled back version may not go through unless they ram it through reconciliation.
And even with reconciliation, if they don't put the idealistic version in it, I can see intense hostility from the progressives here in the United States House who will step to the corner, stomp their feet and scream. And then they won't be able to scrounge up enough Republicans to offset that. It's a tough road ahead of them.
So it could be, so in that case, if progressives in the House walk away, they really could end up with nothing.
With nothing. And then what does the administration show for the entire year? And at some point, they've got to fund the federal government. And while different iterations have been putting the appropriation bills for next year in budget reconciliation and infrastructure and a whole variety of things, At some point, they have to fund the federal government. Even if they can't pass a transportation bill, John, they've got to fund the military. They've got to fund the federal parts of education, agriculture, all those things. They've got to do the appropriations process. Maybe we wind up with a year-long CR. The irony, of course, is that would simply reflect spending levels agreed to in the Trump administration. I think that'll cause the progressives some real heartburn.
Well, and it's government on autopilot. And you've been in Congress long enough to remember the days of regular order when we go through appropriations bills one by one.
Yes.
So one of the arguments progressives are making now is that Republicans are partisan. They're not willing to work in a bipartisan fashion. In my experience, and tell me if this is still true, is that there is a significant number of conservatives, I mean fiscal hawks, conservatives, who view infrastructure as one of the few things the federal government has a legitimate role in investing, and that there's a high multiplier effect. In other words, there's a bang for the buck. And my old boss, Tom Coburn, who you knew well,
tighter than bark on a tree, I might add for the record.
Yeah,
bless his soul.
Yeah, there was no stauncher fiscal conservative, but when it came to infrastructure, he would support infrastructure investments.
Absolutely.
That's still the case in the House.
I think the cadre of my fellow conservatives of Paul Lent category are still there and still strong. The question just simply is, if they don't receive everything they demand, will the ultimate progressives refuse to play with Speaker Pelosi? She only has a 5-seat majority. She can only lose 4 seats for all practical purposes. At that point, can she win over enough Republicans? I just don't know where they're headed right now that they can craft a bill that would pick up a half a dozen or a dozen Republicans. I just don't see that. But again, a lot of things have surprised me in recent years and probably will continue to surprise me.
But I think the takeaway on infrastructure is there's a significant block of conservatives, moderates, all over the Republican conference who would support significant investments in infrastructure.
Yes, John, as long as it's infrastructure, not silly things called infrastructure, as long as it's really infrastructure.
Right. So that'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. So one last question on a policy matter.
Mm-hmm.
There's growing kind of interest and discussion about this idea of a carbon tax, where in order to constrain CO2 emissions, some people argue that we need to put a tax on carbon. What is your take on that? And do you think it has any chance of ever happening?
If you compare a carbon tax under the theory of the carrot and the stick, a carbon tax is a baseball bat. I mean, it's just a baseball bat. You bludgeon stuff with it. I can't support that. I stand by my statement. We need to come up with the next sources, the next level of efficiency, a result of the research we do. The market will take us in that direction. You put a carbon tax on, somebody's got to decide what level of tax for each form of carbon. Somebody's got to decide how much revenue it's going to generate. And oh, by the way, with all this new money, what great new progressive agenda items can we pay for? It's a snake that can bite you both on the front and the back.
Well, that's one of the better mixed metaphors I've heard. It's a snake and a baseball bat. So I take that you're not a fan of the carbon tax.
I am not a fan of the carbon tax, and that's not simply because we produce so many forms of energy in Oklahoma. It's because of the effect that it would have on individuals and on the businesses that they work at and they own. It would be potentially devastating because the rest of the world's not going to do this. So we're going to make every manufactured product in the United States more expensive. We're going to make every transportation cost to move raw materials and finished products more expensive. We're going to make it more expensive to be cool in the summer and warm in the winter. We're going to make dinner more expensive tonight, whether you're having hamburger or pork chops. Oh my goodness. But if you're a progressive, you're scooping up huge amounts of money. You're forcing people to do one thing, and you're using their money then to finance your agenda. It's a sweet deal if you're a progressive / liberal / socialist. I'm not.
But and I think as our study showed, that central command and control economies don't work, and we'll end up with a dirtier environment.
Exactly.
Not a good result. So.
Exactly.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time, and thanks for your leadership with the Conservative Climate Caucus, your leadership in the House Science Committee, Best of luck to you with your farm. I hope your crops do well.
One
And,
thing, John, we always have to remember is under the wonderful Constitution that we operate under, and we should always be mindful how wonderful it is. Every 2 years, the founding fathers gave us the ability to change the entire United States House. Every 2 years, change out a third of the Senate. Every 4 years to change out the president. We just need to pay attention and be responsible and act accordingly on those important election days.
well, Congressman, thank you so much. This has been the Right Voices interview series. I'm John Hart, again, the co-founder of C3 Solutions and the executive editor of our news magazine. You can learn more at c3solutions.org, our news magazine, c3newsmag.com, and check out our Right Voices series. And Congressman, we'll hope to speak with you again soon.
Thank you.